This video is going to cover soldering some slightly larger objects. Hi, I'm James, and we're at University of North Texas Metalsmithing and Jewelry Studios. And this video, we're going to go over some slightly larger soldering setups that might be particularly daunting for some beginners. And what we're going to be doing is just a small cylinder and just a basic butt joint to solder that cylinder all together there. So a simple way of forming it, this is a sheet of copper that's been annealed and cleaned, so it's nice and soft. And if you need the ends to meet nice and evenly, what you can do is you can just simply bend it around a pipe that's approximately the right diameter for what you need to do. And you want to roll it straight so that the ends will meet. And you can reshape this after you're done soldering. The important part is just that the ends are meeting nice and evenly and straight across, so that they're not coming up like this and at a little point, but that the ends meet just like this. So it's the same principle soldering a small ring or a larger cylinder like this. So with soldering of all kinds, whether it's a smaller setup or a larger setup like this, most of the work is in the setup. So if you have everything set up really well, then it should go nice and easily and smoothly. I know for beginners, soldering can be some of the most daunting skills that you're trying to learn in the beginning. But just, practice makes perfect. So you want to make sure your metal is completely clean, that your ends meet nice and evenly, and that you have the whole setup appropriate to what you're trying to solder. So another thing that can be daunting with larger soldering setups is not being able to get enough heat on the piece. So I'm working with the air acetylene torch, and I have a larger torch tip in it, so I'm ready to go with that. And I've also used some extra fire bricks to sort of be like a kiln, where as I'm heating the piece, it's reflecting the heat back onto the piece. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, that as you get a little bit bigger, you don't get enough heat on the piece, and it never seems to reach soldering temperature or anything like that. So what we're going to be doing for the demo is I'm just going to be using medium solder. I save easy solder until the end, just in case I have an additional operation I need to do that maybe I wasn't planning on. And for the sake of the demo, I thought medium would just go a little bit quicker and a little bit easier. So let's zoom in and see the setup and what we're going to do. All right, so we have the cylinder set up here ready to solder. This is a piece that was already soldered, just to show you kind of where we're headed with things. And again, it's important that the butt joint is meeting nice and evenly so that you don't have any big gaps that the solder's not going to fill. For most soldering operations, I prefer to use little chip solder. You can see that I've placed ahead of time lots of little chips to fill that gap. I do have a piece of medium solder ready for stick soldering, where in the heat of the moment you need to add just a little bit of solder. You can have that at the ready. And just as a reminder for maybe the beginners out there, that you always have the ends of the solder bent. So for medium solder, it has two bends there, so I don't lose track of which solder is which. So I have that ready. I will warn you, if you are going to stick solder at all, that it can cause larger floods that take a lot longer to clean up. So I started to clean up the top here, but wanted to leave these areas to show you that this can happen from feeding a little bit too much with the stick solder, as opposed to those little chips. Just leave maybe a teeny little bit that you need to clean up. So this is where we're going with things. I've set up with binding wire, so I've taken just dirty steel wire. This is my old binding wire that's been torched and dirty and everything else, but you want it to be dirty so that it's not going to stick to your solder and get soldered to your piece. So what I find is that another tip that I learned from the Alan Revere Tips book is if you take the binding wire and just do a nice graceful twist all the way through it, that helps it sort of expand with the piece a bit and keep from like bending or breaking or something like that. I also like to use little wedges to keep the binding wire off the seam, because what can happen is as the solder is starting to flow, It can run into your binding wire and either solder that to the piece, or it can run along the binding wire and start flooding out along the edges. So I like to just raise those. Again, it's a little bit more extra setup, but it's well worth it in the end. And then what we're going to do is you do want to have eye protection just in case while something's heating that it boils and something pops off. So you can either use regular safety glasses, or I'm going to use an optivisor so I can really see what's going on there. And we're going to go in, evenly heat the piece. The key, just like with any other soldering setup, is to have the two sides of the seam reaching the even temperature at the same time. If one side of the seam is hotter, all the solder is going to be drawn towards that heat, and it's not going to fill the gap evenly. So you want to heat your piece evenly, and then you can apply the flame to the seam to focus that if you need to, or to move the solder through the seam. So we'll get started here. I have the ventilation on, and so we'll start heating evenly. And you'll notice that this piece will heat up a bit faster because of those kiln bricks reflecting the heat back. You want to watch as the flux is drying out that your little solder chips don't go flying anywhere. Keep both sides heating evenly. And then as the flux goes clear, that'll be approaching the flow temperature of your solder. And if necessary, if any pieces jumped, kind of nudge them back into place. There's just going to be more to clean up later. And the hottest part of the flame is just past that cone. You can see the solder starting to flow now. And then just as an illustration, I'll add some in with the stick solder. And you can see some chips did melt into the seam and flow, and then some chips weren't all the way into the seam and didn't necessarily fill and flow. But you do get a sense, and you saw how quickly this larger piece heated up with the torch. And don't need to take the time in the video, but what we would do at this point is, because of the solder seam, let it air cool. Don't quench it because that's going to stress the seam. So let it air cool, then put it into the pickle, clean the metal completely, get it set up again, and then check by looking through the seam to see if there's any gaps, and make sure that you have solder flowing all the way through the seam. And what you're working towards is just a nice, clean little silver line going through the seam, and clean up any of those other floods, and then decide whatever sort of final surface finish to blend all the areas together so that you have a nice controlled surface finish that's uniform through the whole piece. So that gives you a basic intro. The most important thing is the setup. That's most of your work, so take your time with that. And then if you have it set up well, even if you need to resolder a couple times, you'll have this in place. Just be patient while you let it air cool, pickle it, clean it, set it back up with your binding wire and your little clips and everything. And then you'll have a nice soldered together little cylinder.
If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can hear from me when I post future videos. Thanks for stopping by.